Good evening, and thank you for joining us this evening for a talk with Bianca Marais. My name is Nicole Adams, and I'm a librarian here at the Oshawa Public Libraries, and I'm very excited to be hosting Bianca this evening. I'm going to begin with a land acknowledgement. The land we are standing on today is traditional territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We acknowledge that Oshawa is covered under the Williams Treaties, and as settler on these lands, we are all treaty people. May we respectfully honor the knowledge and understanding of the Indigenous stewards of these ancestral lands and ensure that the voices of the First Peoples are represented in our collections, programs, and services. So I'm pleased to welcome Bianca this evening. She's a writer, podcaster, and creative writing instructor. She's the author of Best Loved books, Hum If You Don't Know the Words from 2017, and If You Want to Make God Laugh from 2019. She teaches at the University of Toronto School of Continuing Studies, where she was awarded the Excellence in Teaching Award for Creative Writing in 2021. A believer in the power of storytelling in advancing social justice, Marais runs the Eunice Ngogodo Own Voices Initiative to empower young Black women in Africa to write and publish their own stories, and is constantly fundraising to assist grandmothers in Soweto with caring for children who have been orphaned by HIV/AIDS. In 2020, Marais started the popular podcast, The Shit No One Tells You About Writing, which is aimed at helping emerging writers become published. She's an experienced public speaker who is in great demand for various events, including, of course, the library conference that she just mentioned. A native of South Africa, Marais now lives in Toronto, Ontario, with her husband and fur babies. And this evening, we'll be discussing Bianca's most recent novel, The Witches of Moonshyne Manor, an enchanting novel about a coven of misfit witches. I'll be asking Bianca a series of questions, and if you have questions of your own, please put them in the chat. Welcome, Bianca.
Nicole, that was the best introduction ever. Will you go on tour with me? My official introducer.
I will do that. I'd love to. I'd be thrilled to just be involved in any way with this book. I'm so thrilled to have you talk with us about The Witches of Moonshyne Manor. It was a delight to read, honestly. I read it in audio and I fell in love with the characters and the setting, and the voice actors that they had doing it were just, it makes or breaks a book, I find. Can you tell us a little bit about this story to start off with? I was going to summarize it and I thought, no, I think I'll let you do that because you know the characters and setting best.
So much. Yeah, the audiobook narrator did an amazing job. To do that many voices is a huge talent. So this book is about 6 witches who are all in their 80s. They live in this amazing haunted mansion called Moonshyne Manor. And that is where they run their business from as well. They run a distillery. They make moonshine. And the townsmen are now coming for them, as townsmen have come for witches for centuries. And they need to fight back against them. And they do that with the help of a 15-year-old TikToker called Persephone, who is hell-bent on bringing down the patriarchy, which she does with the help of her Italian greyhound sidekick, whose name is Ruth Bader Ginsburg. We have a talking crow in the book called Widget. It's just a fun romp of a book that also has quite a bit of social commentary woven into it.
Now, I've heard it described sort of generally or very simply as a witchy rom-com, but it's definitely a departure from your 2 previous novels. But it has a lot of different layers to it, touching on, like as you mentioned, social justice, including a variety of topics ranging from sexism, ageism, female empowerment, which run through all of your work. So there's a thread of commonality there, I think, even though you've switched genres. But what drew you to switch to this different genre to tell this story?
Yeah, so firstly, we did not pitch it as a rom-com at all. So this is something that's interesting that happens, that as authors, we create this work and we pitch it in a certain way, and it'll get marketed quite differently to how we envisioned. So that's always something interesting for people who are interested in behind the scenes in terms of publishing. In terms of why I wrote this book, my first book, Hum If You Don't Know the Words, was about a young girl coming to grips with her own inherent racism during apartheid South Africa, because children at that time were brainwashed to be racist. And it's a story of her and a Black woman who becomes her caregiver, and how she starts to realize how racism works and how awful this is in her society. And my next book looked at South Africa just before Nelson Mandela became president and before the onset of the AIDS pandemic, etc. So those two books were very much books of my heart, based in South Africa, saying all the things that I was so angry about and worked up about, you know, the country of my birth. And they did fairly well. They're still finding their audience, which is wonderful, but they weren't commercial successes. And here's the thing, as a writer, you are only as good as your last book. And in order to keep writing, you have got to sell books. And so a story came to me of two women in their 80s, Ruby and Ursula, who I knew were lifelong friends. There was some dysfunction in the friendship. One of them was having memory issues. And when I started to write it, I thought, oh my word, this is going to be a depressing book. This is just going to be such a depressing book. And I was trying to figure out how to approach the story. And I saw a picture of a haunted house. And suddenly it all just fell into place for me. I knew it was going to be witches and ensemble cast. And that, yes, it was going to deal with feminism and sisterhood, etc. And that I could make it magical. And so I really did want to make it more genre-based and more sort of interesting to readers who were really looking for an escape after COVID, because I needed an escape while writing this book, and I was hoping it could be a wonderful escape for people reading it.
Now, all the witches you mentioned have very distinct personalities. How did you choose which magical trait would come for each witch, and, you know, the name that you gave them and how they spoke to you? Did these characters come alive in a very organic way, or did it take you a while to narrow that down and come up with that?
Yeah, you know what? My characters always come to me first. They say that writers are either plotters, which means they plot everything out before they begin writing, or they're pantsers, because they fly by the seat of their pants. And I am a true pantser. If I know where the story's going before I begin writing, I have zero desire to write it. So I come up with characters first. Once I know who these characters are, I begin writing, and then I follow them and I see where they're going to take me. So, you know, I was inspired by people in my own life. So, for example, Queenie she's kind of the girl boss. She's an inventor. She takes no nonsense. She's a Capricorn A-type control freak. Queenie is very much based on me because that's how I am. I struggle to ask people for help. And that is Queenie's greatest, you know, weakness, that she can't ask people for help. And that's what leads to so many problems with the witches. Ivy is a botanist witch. She makes elixirs that keeps them all healthy. And she was based on my best friend, who's a homeopath in Edinburgh. And so each of them came to me. You know, Jezebel uses seduction as her magical power. And you know, each of them have got their thing. In the beginning, they were called different names. So, for example, Queenie was called Sybil and Ivy was called Zelda. But once I realized that what a big ensemble cast I had and how quickly I was expecting my reader to come on board and figure out who was who, I said, okay, let me change the names so that the names are more in line with their personalities to make it easier to remember. And, you know, as I was writing the characters, I got to know them better. They're all deeply, deeply flawed in the most wonderful ways. And for the people watching tonight, if you read the book and you want to find out which witch you are, you can go to my website, biancamarais.com, scroll all the way down. There is a Which Witch Are You quiz. You can answer 20 questions and it'll tell you which of the witches you are.
I actually did the quiz.
Oh, and
it tells me I'm a Persephone. But I see myself more as a Queenie because I'm like eldest child, kind of a bit of a girl boss, never want to ask for help, always trying to take on too much. But Persephone is sort of like social justice warrior and sort of advocating for the underdog. So I think I'm kind of a mix of the two.
I'm a mix of the two, exactly, Nicole. So I think you and I are probably the same person. And I feel like Persephone and Queenie are just, you know, different sides of the same coin. I think Persephone, if she was raised in a certain way and grew up in a certain way, she would have become a queenie sort of later in life. So she's a lovely character.
You mentioned your own website, and I was going to mention the quiz you'd brought up. But in addition to the number of fun things that are on there, there's also a detailed floor plan of Moonshine Manor, which I wish I'd seen before I read the book, because I was reading it in audio, envisioning. It helped me, like as you mentioned, the voice, the names of the characters tie closely with their abilities, and I think that helped me. But also, the floor plan would have helped too, to know that it's a 3-story manor and there's all these things going on. And I wish I'd looked at that sooner. So if you haven't, when you're reading the book, make sure you check out Bianca's website to see a detailed floor plan. Did you base that on an actual house you'd seen, or was it just what you needed the house to be and you grew from there?
Oh, so it's how I needed the house to be, because it was the very first thing I did before I began writing. I knew that so much of this novel would be set in the manor, and I wanted the manor to come alive as its own character. In fact, I think on my website, there's also a link to the which character you are based on your star sign. And I list the manor as one of the characters with the star sign, because the manor grumbles and groans and it mutters darkly, and it has secrets and opinions. And the manor is just delightful. So I first started off harassing my friend, Brendan, who is a graphic designer. And I sat with him over a few days and I was like, okay, this is how I need, the kitchen to be here, and the fireplaces need to be here, and needs to be a conservatory full of plants, and I need that over here. And we kind of jiggled it around. And once I was happy with the floor plan, I could begin writing, because it's so important in this kind of setting to say, if the character comes out of their bedroom and they need to go downstairs, are they going to turn left or right? Whose bedroom are they going to walk past, and whose conversations might they overhear along the way? And if one of them is sitting in the parlor and they can hear footsteps overhead, who is pacing overhead? So that was something that I've never had to do before. And, that was part of the world building, which was a lot of fun.
Again, on your website, which I was kind of fascinated by, was a book trailer, and as well as a little poster showing your inspiration of who you thought each character might be, using images of well-known actresses. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit about that and who you were seeing in your head as you were writing these characters when you finally decided.
Yeah. So I'm not the kind of author who can create a character completely from scratch. For me, my characters need to be composites of different people, and I need to imagine them, how they move through the world, their physicality. Do they have certain gestures, facial expressions? The one witch is described as having resting witch face. And so when I'm writing them, I need to 100% be able to imagine them as they move through the world. And so it always helps me with every book I've done a vision board first. I think of an actress or somebody I know, and I go, okay, that is the person who I'm going to imagine. So for Queenie, I imagined Whoopi Goldberg, who I thought would be absolutely perfect for her. For Ursula, it's Dame Judi Dench. For Jezebel, the seductress, it's Cher. And there's the Persephone is the I always forget her name. Do you remember her name from Ozark? The girl with the blonde hair.
I don't actually. I saw her in the book trailer, and I couldn't quite remember what her name was. So I'm glad you mentioned Ozark, which I haven't watched. So I'll have to check.
Oh, good. So good in terms of storytelling as well. So yeah, it's actually still above my desk. I need to, and Catherine O'Hara was Ruby. No, not Laura Linney. That was the mother. There's Ruth Langmore from Ozark is the one who I'm picturing as a younger Persephone. But yeah, so it makes such a difference when you can picture Whoopi Goldberg saying these lines as she's marching through the manor with her wand stuck in her hair, and she's wearing her Doc Marten boots as she's reaching into her pocket for a Snickers bar. It just really, for me as the author, it makes it come alive.
So you have a wish list. If they ever optioned this for a movie, you'd be like, I've got my list of.
I have readers who've actually tagged these actresses when they talk about the book because they're so desperate for them to play these parts. Yeah, I do. I have a dream team if this ever gets made into a movie or a series, which, you know, who knows? It's actually out on submission with a film agent who's shopping it around. So I live in eternal hope.
Excellent. Now, what I was really fascinated by, or not, brought me really into the character as well, was the recipes in the front of each chapter, which you include. So, what was your inspiration of these, and what your research process was? Did you test out any of them? Mix up some potions in your kitchen.
Let me take you through that. So I was really so just to take it back one step. So the reason why I love witches is not so much the magic. What I love about witches is that they were the very first feminists. They were the first women to say, I am not going to go from my father's house to my husband's house. I'm not going to be ruled by the church. I'm not going to just have babies because it's expected of me. I'm going to live outside the expectations of what women should be doing. And this made them incredibly powerful and therefore threatening to men, which is why men kept coming for so-called witches. It wasn't because of the magic. It was just because they were not governable. Men didn't know how to control these women. And so they kept coming for them. And something else that was amazing to me about witches was the grimoire. Now, the grimoire is the book of spells. It's all the knowledge that witches pass down from one generation to another. And grimoires just used to be books about the knowledge that women had acquired for generations and passed down through the oral tradition. Because remember, back then, women were not taught how to read and write. And as we all know, a well-read woman is a dangerous creature. And so these women would pass down knowledge about plants, what might help with menstrual cramps, what might help with fertility. And they told their daughters this, and they told their daughters that. And eventually one woman in the family would learn how to write, and she would write all of this down in this book, which then became what we know as the grimoire. So for me, it was like, who learned how to write was like the first librarian of the family. She could curate all stories and put them together in this book. It gives me goosebumps just talking about it, because any of us who love books and who love stories can imagine the oral tradition for centuries until it's finally put in writing for future generations to read. And so I got a whole bunch of grimoires while I was writing this book. Most of them are written by, you know, people who practice Wicca, green witches, etc. And so I read all of those. Many of them were much more serious than what I wanted to do. I really did want to have fun with this. So there are spells in this book. A lot of them are cocktail recipes, mostly cocktail recipes. There's a lot of things for things like full bush care. You know, we have one witch who's like, I'm not going to be grooming, I'm not going waxing, so I'm going to be resplendent as a woman, and I am going to make this tincture for my full bush care. And so I put all these things together, and then here is the thing with me. I always find an expert in whatever I'm writing in, whether it's South African apartheid history, whether it's cultural differences, etc. In this instance, I found a homeopath in Scotland who went through all of my spells. And Nicole, she said to me, she went, "Oh no, dearie, if you send this out the way it is, you are going to break some hoo-hoos out in the world." And I was like, this is a feminist book. We can't break any hoo-hoos. So I said, help me fix it. Tell me how to fix it. And she helped me, and she was like, you got too many essential oils, not enough base oils. Once she fixed them, I tried all the recipes on myself, because I was like, if anyone's hoo-hoo should be broken, it should be mine. And they all work, and they're all lovely, and they're meant to just be fun.
I wasn't quite thinking like you were talking about testing things out. The cocktails as well is like, you know, your favorite cocktails and what each cocktail is sort of tied with a character. You know, they all have their signature cocktail. So it almost reminded me a little of Well, the old recipe books of my grandmother, it made me think of, all the women in my life that have inspired me. And the women are the storytellers for the most part in most people's families. They're the ones that pass things on to the children, telling them stories at night and stories of the family. I'm obsessed with stories of my family, and I want to tell the women's stories in that. So it's sort of inspiring in that way.
There's a long history of women and alcohol, women using alcohol, making a living from alcohol illegally, like throughout the world during moonshine times. And there's a strong tradition of this in South Africa as well. Many Black women in South Africa during apartheid would make their own alcohol, which was called umqombothi. And it was like a sour kind of maize alcohol. And they would sell it in these illegal drinking establishments called shebeens. And they were called shebeen queens. And they didn't drink their own product, but they made it and sold it. And this is how they supported themselves and their families. And that's another thing that I wanted to really pay tribute to with these women who, did whatever they needed to do to put food on the table.
Well, I know that we talked about switching between genres, but I find that feminism and the voice of women are at the core of all your writings. And now you've written a dystopian short story for Audible Originals called The Prin Viper. Can you tell a little bit about that experience and what that's about?
So the thing that Audible does, which is amazing, is that they publish short stories. So for authors like me, it's really difficult to get short stories published because big publishers don't really do short stories. And if they do, it has to be a whole collection. So I had an idea, and it wasn't big enough for a whole novel, but I had this idea that in a dystopian future, as soon as a woman is pregnant, she gets called to trial and she has to defend her right to have her baby. And there is a jury of 13 people. Now, this is not an objective jury as we know them in this day and age. What happens in this dystopian world is that there is software that, based on the DNA of a child, maps out their whole life's trajectory and is able to tell who they might harm in the future, whose lives they will make better by being in the world. And so the jury are these people whose descendants will be affected by this child's birth. And so they are extremely, extremely prejudicial, very subjective. They hear all the evidence from the state software, which is called quasi-COSO, which is short for, computational software. And then they get to, cast their vote as to whether the child is allowed to be born or not. And it seems really, out there. But again, everything I write, Nicole, comes from a place of rage. I write about the things that infuriate me about the world. Nothing upsets me more than, prejudice, racism, homophobia, and misogyny. And we have seen over the last how long that women's rights keep getting come for. Whether women get told they cannot terminate pregnancies or whatever the case may be, is what it boils down to is women's bodies being controlled. And so in this dystopian future, women who it's going the other way, as opposed to them wanting to terminate pregnancies, they desperately want to have children, and they are being told by a jury maybe they can't, and that their pregnancy needs to be terminated. But that book's got a heck of a twist. It's the whole thing happens in the space of a few hours. It's during the trial. You hear the whole trial unfolding, and then the jury deliberates, and then there's a bit of a twist.
Now, how is writing a short story different than writing a full-length novel for you? What was a different experience for you?
Yeah, that's such a good question, because you may have noticed in my replies, I'm very long-winded. I am not somebody who will just write 5 words when 3 paragraphs will do. And so you've got so much less time to really develop a story. In an average novel, you've got 80,000 words. And if you've only got one protagonist, that's 80,000 words with one protagonist to get the reader to be on that character's side, to root for them, to really like be, wanting the best for that character. But when you're writing a short story, I think my short story was 16,000 words, and I think I had 6 different characters. So you have got very little time to fully develop a character, for the listener to understand what's at stake, what it is that that character wants, what their vulnerabilities are, how they might be flawed. So, it was much, much tougher for me than writing a novel. I really take my hat off to people who write short stories.
So you've been teaching creative writing for some time now, and also have a podcast called The Shit No One Tells You About Writing. So what drew you to want to help teach new writers, and how did you become involved in these ventures?
I love teaching. I love teaching creative writing. I love sitting with students and seeing them have a light bulb moment, whether it's when they finally realize the difference between showing versus telling, or story structure, whatever the case may be is. So I was teaching at U of T in class just before the pandemic hit. And at any given time, I might have up to 15 students. But the rest of the time, I found that I had people reaching out to me all the time on social media or emailing me and saying, Bianca, I want to write a novel, but I don't know how to find an agent, or I don't know how to find out information about characterization or pacing. And so I would reply to people, send long emails. And then I was getting frustrated because I was just really limited in the amount of people that I could reach in that time. And then, COVID hit, and all of my summer plans, along with everybody else's, got canceled. And I was sitting going, what could I do? And I reached out to a few independent bookstores in Ontario, and I said to them, let's run a few online author events, because readers still want to connect with authors. They just can't come into bookstores. And so along with Blue Heron in Uxbridge, we did a whole thing with like 30 authors, I think, where I was interviewing them, and people were just really responding to it and loving it. And so I realized, well, I'm not that awful at interviewing people, so maybe I should do a podcast about writing. And of course, I don't even listen to podcasts. I'd listen to one or two, and I found it frustrating that 10 minutes after the podcast began, people were still talking about what coffee they drank and how their week was and what they were wearing. And I'm just like Queenie in my book. I'm like, come on, people, let's get down to business here. Let's just use our time wisely. And so I started this podcast where I reached out to authors I knew, and I said, will you talk to me about your process? Will you talk to me about advice for writers? And then after 6 months, I got 2 literary agents to come onto the show so that our listeners could send us their query letters and their first 5 pages. Because when you're a writer, if you want to get published, you have to get an agent. You can't just send your manuscript to Penguin Random House and go, oh, please publish me. So you have to land an agent who then, will submit your work to publishers. But it is so difficult to get an agent. I think 1% of writers who pitch their works to agents actually get an agent to represent them. And then they still have to get a publisher to help them. So we look at people's query letters and their opening pages, and we give them advice, and we say, you're burying the lead. This is the hook, but you haven't fully explained it. The plot paragraph isn't properly developed. Your opening pages are too passive. We don't see what's at stake. We don't see characters' emotion. The characters by themselves just thinking. And if you watch that on the screen, it would be quite boring. So have the character moving around, have them interacting with other characters, give us a central conflict. And so we've been doing that now for 2.5 years. And the most rewarding thing, Nicole, is when we get emailed by people who have landed their agent, who've now sold their novels, and who were on our show 2 years ago as we helped them polish it. And it's been so incredibly rewarding. And that's just another form of sisterhood, quite honestly. And that's something that fascinates me, how women band together to help each other and lift each other up.
Well, that ties in with my next question. I mentioned in the introduction that you run the Eunice and Gogodo Own Voices initiative to empower Black South African women writers to tell their own stories. So who was Eunice, and how did you become involved in that initiative?
So Eunice was my childhood caregiver. So when I was born, I was brought home to a black maid, which is how things worked in South Africa at that time. Both of my parents worked. There wasn't kindergarten or anyone to look after me. And Eunice Ngogodo was my childhood caregiver. And what that woman went through, oh my God, when I think about it, I get so emotional. And my first book was a love letter to Eunice. It was dedicated to her, because I cannot imagine who I would be today without Eunice's presence in my life. Because as I say, as a child born and raised in apartheid, we were brainwashed to be racist. And I had this woman in my life who had to leave her 5 children behind in the Bantu homeland of the Transkei. She could only see them once a year for 2 weeks at Christmas. The rest of the time, she lavished all of her maternal affection on me, pretty much the child of the oppressor. And she did it without any bitterness, without any anger, and just such love and grace. And so, my whole life, she has been the single most important person in my life in terms of guiding who I am today. And Eunice is turning 100 on the 8th of May. And wow. I got to see her last year in June, just after her 99th birthday. If any of you are on Instagram, go to my Instagram page, scroll down, and you will see a picture of Eunice and I together. And, I wanted her name to be known, because I remember when I told her that my debut novel was dedicated to her, she said to me, "Why me, my dear? I was just a maid. I was no one special." And that just broke my heart, because, we don't need to be politicians or actors or famous people to change the world. She changed my world, and I want the world to know about her. And so I set up the Eunice Ngogodo Own Voices Initiative and the fund. We've done multiple things over the years. We've helped many grandmothers in Soweto who lost all of their children to the AIDS pandemic, and then were left to raise sick grandchildren with really minimal resources. And so we've done a ton of fundraising for the gogos, which is the grannies in Soweto, to care for their grandchildren. And then, after writing my first 2 books, I wrote both of them with a Black character's perspective in each of them, because I tried to write it without a Black character's perspective, and it just felt so flat. It just felt like the perspective of privileged white people. And you can't really look at a 360-degree view of race and how it affects everyone if you're just telling it from the point of view of, the oppressor. And while I wrote that, I knew I didn't want to appropriate a voice that wasn't mine. And so I did it as respectfully as I could. I hired sensitivity readers, Black authors in South Africa, to read my work, and they helped me get it right, because there were a lot of times I got it wrong. And then I entered into conversations with many of these Black authors in South Africa who were really frustrated about the fact that they were not being published internationally. And I realized that I was part of the problem. If I was telling their stories, even though I had the best intentions, I was still telling their stories, and I didn't want to do that anymore. And so, we started the Own Voices Initiative. We've put a young woman through the MFA program at the University of Johannesburg. And she is an award-winning writer, and she's going to produce the most amazing, amazing work. And so that's now what, I'm wanting to do, rather empower young Black women in South Africa to tell their own stories, rather than me being a part of the problem by trying to tell their stories for them.
That's so inspiring to sort of want to take something that you grew up with and flip the script and look at it from the 360 view. That's and trying to empower others to tell that story. That's very noble endeavor, but also much needed. And I think it's not something we see very often, to sort of expand upon that. Now,
and what enabled that was the conversations we were having about who should be allowed to tell a story, who has the right to tell a story, et cetera, et cetera. And this is why these kinds of conversations are so important because, for example, I was inspired by The Help, Catherine Stockett's The Help. When it first came out, I read that book and it was devastating to me because it resonated so much with my own South African experience, but it wasn't my experience. And so I wanted to write my experience. And now we look back at The Help and we go, well, it's very problematic because it's a white savior narrative, etc. But I like to think of each of these books as being on a rung of a ladder. We can't keep getting higher up unless we step on that rung and explore what's on that rung and then aspire to do better every time. And I always say, once we know better, we should be better, we should do better. And, you know, so this is something that it was a community of people who had these conversations with me, and had they not been so generous with their time and their views, it's not something that I ever would have done. So I certainly credit, you know, the whole writing community for that.
Now, you, to get back to, I'm just going to go back to talk about the book itself, Witches of Moonshyne Manor. One thing that I found that not a lot of people do, because there's a lot of flashbacks in the book where you're going from the present day and the, you know, octogenarian witches going back into when they first came to the manor and how they came to the manor. And then, you know, a little bit later and their experiences and jumping back and forth. I found the way you did this to clearly state at the start of each chapter exactly where and when we are in the story. That doesn't happen very often in novels. And especially listening to an audio, it's like, okay, we're at Moonshine Manor, it's this date, you know, and it helped center me in the story. So I found this especially helpful. Why did you choose to do that?
Podcast all the time. We give this advice to writers is give a date and a timestamp. Orient the reader in time and place. And yes, you can do that, you know, in the first or second paragraph by saying, you know, this music was playing on the radio, or this was the fashion, or whatever. But honestly, it's just easy for a reader to say, this is when this was. And this book, you know, I went back to the witches because they're all orphans. I wanted to break with the tradition of witch books, which was all about the maternal line of magic being passed down. Because what about witches who were orphaned? Does that mean that they didn't get to be magical? So I wanted to explore found family and witches who were orphaned. And so I touch on each of them when they're about 6 to 8 years old, when they do come to the manor. But in this book, there is something that happened 33 years ago that led to where the witches are today. There was a magical heist that went wrong. It had serious repercussions, and the ripple effects have been felt to the witches to this day. And so I needed to have dual timeline narrative. There was the timeline of when the witches were in their 50s, and then there's the modern day narrative. And, you know, I didn't want my readers to be confused as to where they were in time and space. And so, you know, you just put that timestamp at the top of the chapter and you tell us which character you know, if you're doing a multi-POV novel, you might say which character it is. You say the date, where it's happening, and boom, the reader's orientated.
Would you think that some writers don't do that because they don't want to take people out of the story and they think it'll seem too like you're seeing the mechanics behind the novel if you show that?
No, because it's just so simple. Here's the thing. I have been told by a ton of readers that they don't read that anyway. A lot of my readers just dive in and they don't even look what chapter it is, what time or whatever it is. So you still within the text have to make it clear that this is the past, or, you know, that this is happening in a different place so that they're not completely confused. You know, I think when you give the readers a lot of heavy lifting to do, which is what I did in this book, I always trust my reader implicitly. I trust them to get what I'm saying. I trust them to figure out endings, because I don't always tie up endings very neatly, because I don't think that's true to life. So I expect my reader to do quite a bit of heavy lifting in terms of figuring things out. And if I'm going to put that much stress on them, in other instances, I really want to make it as easy for them as possible. And quite honestly, every one of my books, except for my Audible original, you will see at the chapter, it'll, say which character it is, the date, and where it's happening.
I wish more would do that. So if we look on I always look at that. Now, you mentioned that part. So to take on that, do you have a particular writing routine and how you plan your novels? Like, do you write in the morning or the evening? Do you have like blocking yourself off with time with your other obligations? Because you have so many. How do you find time to write and plan out your novels?
Yeah, that's such a tough one. I remember reading Stephen King's On Writing, and he said, you need to treat writing like a job, a 9-to-5 job. You sit down at 9, you write until 5. And I'm like, yeah, a man wrote this, a man who has a wife and staff to take care of all of his things. Most women writers, they've got kids, they've got other jobs, they've got side hustles, they've got a family to take care of, they have pets, they can't sit down from 9 to 5 and write during that time. There's doctor's appointments, there's all kinds of things. And that's, true for me as well, because I run the podcast, I teach creative writing. So there's a lot happening at any given point. And here is the thing, I'm not someone who waits for the muse to strike, but there are definitely times when my brain's not working particularly well, and sitting down to write during that time is going to be a waste of time. But then I'll sit and brainstorm, and I will maybe go back and edit work that I did before. Now that I'm having menopause, I am up at 2 a.m., between 2 and 4 a.m., having hot flushes, and I cannot sleep. So sometimes I'll get up at 2 to 4 and write, and then I'll go back to sleep again. Sometimes I write in the morning, sometimes it's at night. For me, writing is my pressure valve. If I don't write for perhaps a week, I start to get chest pain. It starts to build up and I'm like, I need that release. And then I will make the time and I'll sit down and write. So I think it's possible to be a serious writer and not, have the luxury or be privileged enough to write from 9 to 5, just so long as you are prioritizing yourself and you're prioritizing your writing. And you know what, with this book, Nicole, these were some of my favorite imaginary friends that I've ever had. And they would call to me, it was almost like being heckled by 6, 8-year-old women who were like, sit down, Missy, this book's not going to write itself. And it's like they come up and they whisper their story to me and I'm just getting it down. I don't know if you've seen that meme of Kermit the Frog banging away. It's a GIF. It's quite funny. It just bangs. And sometimes it's like that. But if I stay away from them too long, they're just like, Bianca, come, bum in chair, let's get working.
With all the things you have on your plate, how do you find time to read? And are there any particular genres that you enjoy reading?
Read 3 to 4 books a week.
Whoa. Okay.
I am first and foremost a reader. It was my love of reading that made me become a writer. I will never forget The Alchemy. When people say to me, do you believe in real magic? I go, I believe in the power of 26 letters and some punctuation, depending on how you move that around, to create worlds in people's minds. And if that's not magic, I don't know what is. And I remember when I first learned how to write and read, it was just like, whoa. And since that, I have always read voraciously. Now for the podcast, what happens is, the great thing is I don't have to buy books anymore. I get publishers sending me a ton of books because they want me to have their authors on the podcast. And I don't want to interview an author if I haven't read their book. So I will have sort of 3 podcast interviews a week, and I will read as much as I can. Sometimes I'm only able to get to about 50 pages before I interview them, but I read across all genres. I adore literary fiction because I believe that literary fiction is what makes us deeply human. It's what gives us empathy. It allows us to live the experiences of all these people that we will never get to experience in our lives. So I love literary fiction, but I also love genre fiction. I love murder mysteries. I love romance novels. I love memoir. I don't read a lot of nonfiction, but any genre, here's the thing, a good story, well told. I'm a sucker for it. It doesn't matter what genre. I'm not snobbish about what I read. I think every genre has something to offer, whether it's escapism, whether it teaches us something about the world or what it means to be human. And, I think it was, I'm just trying to think which author it was. He said, books are like mirrors. You will never see anything in them that isn't already within yourself. And books reflect ourselves back to ourselves. And so all genres, love them.
Yeah, it sounds like you could have been a librarian in another life.
100%, a librarian or a bookseller, definitely.
So what's next for you? Will there be more books featuring the witches? Perhaps one telling Persephone's story? Because we're just getting to know her. She was kind of on the sidelines quite a bit in the story. She wasn't the main focus. And, I know that it's hard to get one book published, let alone a series, but do you have plans for more?
Oh, I have ideas for a prequel with Great Aunt Mirabel, who is the woman who brings all the witches to the manor. When they're little girls. I have an idea for Persephone's story after where the story ends as she grows into her powers. But, it is really difficult to sell a series. It's really tough. The first book has to do really, really well. This book has been a bestseller in Canada, which has been absolutely amazing. It was a dream come true of mine to have a book on the bestseller list. For now, I'm not writing a sequel or a prequel. Hopefully, if the book gets made into a movie, that allows me to come back to it. So, for example, Alice Hoffman didn't write the sequel to Practical Magic for many years. She wrote Practical Magic, then wrote other books. And then after many years, readers were like, we want more. And then she came back and did it. What I'm now challenging myself to do, Nicole, as a pantser is, and this sounds really, it sounds out there, I am writing a closed room murder mystery with magical people. I call it Knives Out meets Succession meets Alcanto. And I'm trying to pants it, right? A closed room murder mystery when you don't know who the murderer is, why they've murdered anyone. And it has been such a joy to write this book because I write up until a certain point, and then I'm like, okay, now I really need to know who the murderer is. And then I huddle with these characters and I'm like, okay, guys, you've got to give me something. Yeah, which one of you is the one who's been murdered? Why might you want to murder him, etc. So I'm halfway through that. And, we will see if my publisher likes it. I will be showing it to them soon. And hopefully I get to continue with that. Something that I struggle with as an author is that the modern publishing industry wants to put authors in boxes because it makes it easier for them to market them. So they want to go, you are a historical fiction author, you are a romance author, you're a thriller writer, because it makes it so much easier. And I think that the reason we're authors is because our creativity is so huge and we get inspired by so many things. I could sit down right now and write a rom-com. I could sit down now and write a thriller. I have so many different ideas. So for me, the challenge is carving out a career for myself as someone who's a bit unpredictable, so that when readers go to the library and they go, well, it's Bianca Marais. What the hell is she doing this time? Let's see. So we'll see if I manage to get away with that.
Well, so far you've got me hooked. I know I'm in the middle of the Audible original, and I've got both of your other books. I'm halfway through the first of your novels. So I'm hoping to build on that, and I'll be following you along, definitely. And I had one last question for you. Do you have a rage room?
I live in a shoebox apartment in downtown Toronto, near St. Lawrence Market. I am lucky to just have a room that is dark in which I can write. I do not have a rage room. Now, the reason Nicole's asking is because Jezebel in the Witches of Moonshyne Manor has a rage room. And she has so much rage. And I feel like she channels the rage of women across the world. And when life gets too much, she goes and just throws things and breaks plates, etc. but it's fine because they're magical. They can put them back together again, so it's not very expensive. But I am desperate for a rage room. I've even looked up ones in Toronto. I think there was one, but it didn't look like it was really going to manage to deal with all of my rage. But that is the dream one day, is to have a rage room. I think other women dream of having huge closets for all their clothes and all their shoes and things like that. I'm like, I own like 5 pairs of shoes. I don't need that. But if I could have a rage room, that would be pretty awesome.
Agreed. Thank you, Bianca, for joining us this evening. It was a pleasure speaking to you about your book. I can't wait to read more. My reading pile has just gotten much, much larger. I hope you've all enjoyed this evening's program. Please check out the links in the chat to Bianca's book in our library catalog and also on her website and her publisher's website. There's links in there to her podcast. Just Google Bianca Marais. You'll find a whole number of things, including her website where she links to all the things we mentioned, her fun quiz on which witch are you, and of course, all the interviews that she's given about the book. Also, take a look at our newsletter on the website at oshawalibrary.ca to see what events we're planned for the next few months. The new edition of the newsletter will be out this week. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and have a great evening.
Thanks, Nicole. Bye, everyone.